Hello and welcome. This is Eagle Eye 621, and today we're here to talk about the best enchantments you can have for your weapons. This is for the 1.16 and above version with the introduction of netherite, and there are some important changes that you should have for your weapon enchantments that you would not have done in 1.15 and below. Now, I did some other videos on your armor types and tool types with the protection and speed enchantments. There'll be some links in the iCard and the description to those right now. And these videos do take quite a while, so I would really appreciate it if you would hit that subscription button and ring that bell. There's also going to be a lot of information, and this video might be a little bit on the longer side, so there should be some timestamps that are embedded in the video, so you can jump around to see exactly what you're looking for. And with that, let us get started with these weapons. And I will take you to these chests, which we will use before explaining all of these charts over here. And I'm actually going to skip these two for now, just so you can get a feel for how it looks with the Trident. And the way that you get a Trident is from Drowned. You can't craft them. And there are actually two different types of your best Trident enchantments. This is a little bit duplicative of what we did in the tools, but you can put Mending, Unbreaking, and Impaling on them. This makes the impacts hurt more with higher hit points. And then you need to choose between a Riptide, and you can have 1, 2, or 3, 3 being the most powerful, or the Loyalty and Channeling. The Loyalty means when it's thrown, it will come back to you, and the Channeling will make a lightning strike if the weather conditions are correct. You do want to avoid the Curse of Vanishing if you can. And the reason I start with this is to get us started on these charts that you can see right here. And we can take a look at some numbers. And for your Trident, your range attack is 8 hit points, where if you add your Impaling 5, the range attack turns into a 20.5. Now, to be clear, each heart is worth 2 hit points, so a 20.5 would be just over 10 hearts. Now, if you instead used a melee attack, that would be 9 normally, or 21.5 with your Impaling 5. So it is a little bit harder of a hit to punch them with it than it is to throw them at the enemies. Now, just as an aside, you can get a critical hit with the Trident, and that would turn this into a 13 for normal and a 25.5 for Impaling. As you can see from that note down below, you can't get a crit attack in water. You need to be falling in order to get a critical attack, but you can't be in water because you can't be falling in water in a way that will register as a critical attack. So this is in the unlikely event that you pull one of the water mobs out. And to be clear, Impaling 5 is only effective against those water mobs, and where that's going to come out is for your Guardians and your Elder Guardians. And your Guardian has 30 hit points, which, as I mentioned, would be 15 hearts, whereas the Elder Guardian has 80, which would be 40 hearts. And you can just kind of see the attack strength. We have the base plus the enchantment for the range, melee, and critical. You can see that none of them are enough to one-shot any of the enemies. And just for those numbers as well, for a range attack on your Guardian, it would take 4 shots without the enchantments or 2 with the Impaling 5. The melee would be also 4 shots, or with the Impaling 5, 2 shots. And your Elder Guardian is going to be 10 shots with the range, or 9 without any of those enchantments. Those drop to 4 and 4 with those enchantments. So the enchantment really does make this tool a lot better. But in terms of your attack strength, you're really only going to use this in the water. Do note that a Drowned does not count as a water mob. It counts as an undead mob. So your Impaling 5 is not going to give you your bonuses. It's just going to be this layers right here, or your unenchanted. So now that you understand how that works a little bit, let's talk about what may be the most controversial thing, and that is your perfect sword. And I actually have 3 right here. This is how you craft it, and then you use a smithing table and some netherite to turn it into a netherite sword. And we have 3 different choices here. I'll let you see those, but we'll go back over them in a moment. All of them can have your Mending, Unbreaking 3, and Sweeping Edge 3 on them, which I do say you should have on all of them. Then in terms of non-compatibility, you can choose between the Bane of Arthropods, a Sharpness 5, or a Smite 5. These do come in lower numbers, but these are the best enchantments. There's no reason to go lower than the max. These are not compatible with each other. You do need to pick one, with some very small exceptions to some glitched drops, and I'll throw an iCard up right now. You also can choose your Looting 3, which is typically something you're going to want, but we'll talk about that in 1 second. And then you can choose to have a knockback on it if you want, 1 or 2. And you can also put Fire Aspect on your sword, which will cause the mobs to burn. And Curse of Vanishing is something to be avoided. So now let's talk about them, and then I'll show you what's going on over there. This is the kind of sword that I carry around for your normal use. It has your Mending, Unbreaking, Sweeping Edge, and then I picked the Smite 5 and the Looting 3. I will explain the Smite in a lot more detail in a moment, but do be aware, some people like Fire Aspect. If you have Fire Aspect, I would highly recommend you take a knockback 1 or 2, or else you're going to light a mob on fire and it's going to punch you and catch you on fire, which is very annoying. So if you do like the knockback or the fire aspects, you can definitely put those on your swords. I tend not to like them. And then I also recommend you get an XP sword, that being something that you'll notice does not have the looting on it, which is the difference between the sword that I generally carry and this XP sword. And that's for something like an Enderman farm, because with an Enderman farm, the ender pearls they drop actually become a headache and they start causing issues. So you want them to drop less of them, you're just going for the XP. So you don't always want those looting drops, and sometimes it's just a hassle to deal with them and sort them and get rid of them, and they start lagging up your world as they just pile up on the ground. So do keep that in mind. But now let's talk about the controversial one, and that being the Sharpness versus the Smite. Bane of Arthropods is really not in contention. If spiders are your problem, get good. Just kidding. But spiders are really not going to be what's going to be killing you in your world. And while they do hurt the spiders and they slow them down, really that's not the contention. It's your undead mobs versus your other mobs. So now let's talk about this chart right here, or graph. That'll come with this into play, and then this will be sort of a side bonus. So now let's talk about the difference between the Smite and the Sharpness. And with a netherite sword with Smite 5 and Sweeping Edge, because I put Sweeping Edge on the swords, and that'll come into play in a little bit, you will get a 20.5 hit points. That's for your sword normally. Or if you do a crit attack, that would be 24.5 hit points. Now, Sweeping Edge is not just the same damage to all of the mobs around it. There is a reduction in how much that will hurt the mobs. And your Sweeping Edge for your Smite 5 would be 16.75 hit points for the mobs that you don't hit. So the mob you hit directly will take the 20.5 because you can't do a crit if you're doing a Sweeping Edge, and the other mobs around it will take 16.75. Now, if we instead do Sharpness, then for the Sharpness 5, it's 11 hit points, with the critical being 15, and the Sweeping Edge will be 9.25 hit points. Now, of course, the Smite 5 only affects undead mobs, whereas the Sharpness will affect all the mobs. And I made some charts, and you'll see that in a second. I did not include in that chart the Fire Aspect. The Fire Aspect will do 7.5 hit point damages, and those are burns. Do keep in mind, not all mobs will burn, and also if they jump into water, then the water will stop that. So I didn't put that in this one. That'll come into play over here a little bit more with some other weapons. But now let's take a look at the different types of where this puts us. And I have right here the Diamond Sword with Smite 5 would be 19.5 hit points, the crit being 23, but we're not really going to pay attention to that for a reason that you'll see in a little bit. And you'll notice that right here at our chart, this level is 20, and the sword isn't quite there. It's 19.5, whereas now the Smite sword with the netherite is enough. It's 20.5. So what are these mobs that we're talking about? This would be your skeleton, stray, zombie, drowned, husk, the zombie piglins, zombie villagers, or the phantoms, as well as your wither skeleton skull, all have 20 hit points. And that means that if you have a Smite 5 sword, all of these mobs are one-hit kills. And that is going to be very important. Do note that there are some others, the zombie skeleton horse or the zombie horse, or the skeleton horse, excuse me, have 15, so they're less than this. I didn't put. And the wither has either 300 hit points or 600 for the bedrock. Now, that's actually more than the dragon, which you'll see down there at the end. So that's just something to keep in mind. But with my easy wither rose farm, you don't really fight the wither, so this is not going to be as important, but just something to keep in mind. And also keep in mind that the Zoglin does have 40 hit points, and what that looks like in terms of the sharpness, which you can just see visually. The sharpness comes across at this level, which we're paying attention to, the non-crit level, versus this level, and this is enough for a one-shot, and that's not. So let's talk about what that is. And you can see that for this side, we have the Smite on top and the Sharp on the bottom. And for your Smite, you can see that it is a one-shot hit normally. It's also a one-shot hit with the critical, and a 2-hit on the sweeping edge, whereas your Sharpness is 2 across the board. And over here on your Smite is going to be 2 and 2 for your normal and crit, and a 3rd for your sweeping edge, whereas it's going to be a 4, 3, and 5 for your Sharpness versus that Smite. So now, what does the Sharpness do that the Smite would not be able to do? And this section right here shows the rest of the mobs with some hit points. It's not completely filled, but it has the really important ones in there. And you can see that we're going to start here on this end in terms of 8 health points. And we have our Endermite and Silverfish. You have your Ghasts with 10, your Spiders with 12. These are the cave spiders, the ones that poison you, not the normal ones you find in the overworld. These Vex have 14, as well as your Spider, Piglin, Slime, and Magma Cubes at 16. These Slime and Magma Cubes are the large ones. The smaller ones have less hit points. Your 20 here for your Creeper and Blaze gets a little bit more with your Illagers, the Evoker, Pillager, and Vindicator at 24, with your Witch a little bit higher, Shulker a little higher than that, and your Hoglin and Enderman at 40, and 40 is what tops out over on the Smite side. But then there are some other mobs. The Piglin Brute, which is coming up, will have 50. The Ravager has 100, and the Ender Dragon has 200 health points, as I mentioned, less than the Wither. But now, in terms of our Sharpness, again, we have to choose between the normal attack, the critical attack, and the sweeping edge. And for your Smite Sword, you just get the unenchanted levels of damage because the Smite is not effective against these other mobs. So now on this side, we have the Sharp on top and the Smite on the bottom. And you can see here that we had one-shot these Endermites and Silverfish. These are pretty weak, no matter what we're using, except for the sweeping edge will take an extra shot from the Smite sword. You can see that we are also here with a little bit of a division where the Sharp could one-shot, whereas the Smite would require 2 shots for a Ghast. But honestly, you're not using your sword against a Ghast, so this doesn't really come into play. And you can see here that things actually look pretty even for a while. The Sharp and the Smite still have the same here, and this is for your Cave Spider. They have pretty much the same here, except for the crit. You can one-shot crit with the sword here for the Vex, but that also won't come into play, and you'll see that in a moment. And on here we have again the same, and that's for your normal spider with your slime and magma cubes and the piglin. And then here we do have something not as similar. Sharp is a 2-shot versus Smite being a 3-shot. And that's for your creeper and your blaze. So you will require an extra shot with your Smite sword. But again, that'll come up. And then I'll just scroll through some of the rest of these that you can see things remain fairly similar. There are some changes like right here where you have a 3-shot versus a 4-shot. And that continues here as well. That's for your Witch and your Shulker. But over here, you can see that it's pretty much the same, except for the sweeping edge is 1 extra, and that's with your Illagers. And then things do start to diverge a bunch with your Hoglin and Enderman and your Piglin Brute. Not all that much. First, it's the 4 versus a 5, and the sweep is a 5 versus a 6. And then here things do start to separate for some of the more powerful hit point creatures. But now let's talk about why this matters and why this comes into play. But let me also just make an important point. This sweeping edge 6 versus sweeping edge 5 for your Enderman. If you're using my Enderman XP farm, for example, your Smite 5, even though it takes an extra shot to kill them, is plenty fine. You can still get your 60,000 XP per hour, no issue. So when you're comparing now your Smite versus your Sharpness, what you're really talking about is the mobs that you think you're going to fight the most of in close quarters that are going to give you the most problems. And that's really here, in my opinion, your skeletons, strays, zombies, and drowns are going to be a lot more of mobs you're going to hit in clumps than what you're going to find over here, which when it really starts to spread out, you're talking about a creeper or blaze is not something you're going to typically fight in clumps, especially if you're using my blaze farm. And your Illagers, you may have a little bit of an issue, but again, these are pretty much the same. You're typically not going to get all of them in that same sweep, so there's no real change. And really, the 1-shot versus 2 shots is a huge difference. And this will come into play specifically for the second weapon you're going to be holding, and that's over in this chart, and that would be the axe. So let's talk about the axe very briefly. And the netherite axe with sharpness 5 has 13 hit points, or 18 for crit attack, whereas your smite 5 is going to be 22.5 with a crit of 27.5. But again, that's only for your undead mobs. If you're fighting normal mobs, then it's just your unenchanted value. So your actual more powerful attack in the game that you're going to try and one-shot as many mobs as you can with is actually going to be your sharpness axe, because as you can see, it comes up to this level, which is going to be 18 crit hit points. And because you don't have sweeping edge on an axe, you can get that critical attack each time. And that means that up until right about here, this is the 16, the next block is the 20, you can one-shot any of these mobs with your sharpness axe, which you should be holding. And the bottom line is that your Sharpness and your Smite should be offset. If you have a sharp sword, as we did before 1.16, because there was no point, you couldn't one-shot these mobs anyways, then you put Smite on your axe. Because we now should have Smite on our sword, we're going to put Sharpness on our axe to make up for it. The only place it may ever really come into play is specifically for the Wither, but again, if you saw that link, you're not really going to be fighting Withers that much. That's not what's important. So now let's go back and look at our axe so we can see our perfect axe as a weapon. And this is what I carry around. It's a Sharpness 5, Efficiency 5, Unbreaking 3, Mending, and Silk Touch. Now, to be clear, you can have your Mending and Unbreaking 3, as well as your Efficiency 5. You can put these on all of them. You then need to choose between your Silk Touch and your Fortune. I prefer the Silk Touch. You can instead put Fortune with that Sharpness 5. The reason I typically like the Silk Touch better is because you can collect the blocks or the leaves or whatever it is that you want, and then if you need to convert them, you can always convert them later. You can't turn that stick or that apple or that sapling back into a leaf once you've already fortuned it or whatever else it is you're doing. And then you also then have to choose between the Bane of Arthropods, the Sharpness, or the Smite 5, as already indicated. Now, I will leave this Smite 5 here in case you're fighting a Wither legitimately. The Smite 5 is going to help you out a lot because you're going to be attacking it with an axe, but otherwise, really, you want to stick to your Sharpness 5, Efficiency 5, Unbreaking 3, Mending, and Silk Touch. Of course, this is how you make it, and then you add the netherite ingot and the smithing table to your diamond, and you get your netherite axe. Let's move down the line a little bit, and we're talking about ranged weapons. Of course, your Trident is a ranged weapon, but really it's an underwater ranged weapon for your mobs that are underwater. Let's talk about the differences between a bow and a crossbow. And let's start with our bows. You can have your Unbreaking 3 on it, which is a must. Then you choose between Mending or Infinity. This is a bit of a preference. My preference is on the Infinity, because that way you just don't have to worry about arrows. And by the time you're in a place in your world where you can make a perfect bow, the making another one when you have to eventually repair it or replace it really isn't an issue, and just not worth the headaches about worrying how many inventory slots are you going to fill up with arrows and worry about that. But that's, of course, up to you. Power 5 is a must as well to get that maximum amount of strength. And you can put Punch 1 or Punch 2 on your bow. And you can also add Flame. And again, avoid your Curse of Vanishing. This is how you make it right here. And just be aware that if you have some older worlds, you could get both Mending and Infinity on that same bow. That was removed in 1.11.1. But if you have any bows with both of those enchantments, they do still work exactly as you think they would. And this would obviously be better. Now, I like the Infinity, as I said. I put a Flame, Power 5, Unbreaking, Punch 1, and the Infinity, as I mentioned. And if you're going to have Flame, I do like a little bit of a punch because your sword is up close and your arrow is to get things away from you. Punch 2, in my opinion, is a little bit too far, but if that is your preference, then you can swap that out. And then if you want to do your Mending, it's the same idea. Your Power 5, Unbreaking 3, Flame, and Punch 1, just with your Mending. Just a little Easter egg. I do like having a Troll bow with me as well. That's a Punch 2, Unbreaking, and Infinity. Now, this is just to mess with your friends a little bit, but also before there were rockets, you could use your wings and shoot yourself in order to get flight and go places. And in a pinch, if you run out of rockets and you've done a little training, this is a decent way to get around. So make sure you're wearing okay armor and don't put the Power 5 on this. Don't put any power on this so you don't really hurt yourself all that badly, if at all. Now let's compare that to our crossbow, and we'll see some charts over there in a second. And your crossbow is made just like this. And you can have your Mending, Unbreaking 3, and your Quick Charge 3. These are all a must. You should have all of these. Then you do need to make some choices. You can have your Piercing on them, or you can have your Multi-Shot on them. Multi-Shot will split your arrow into 3 arrows for the same price of that 1 arrow, and your Piercing will let it go through the number of mobs it mentioned. So a Piercing 1 will go through 1 mob and hit another. Piercing 2 will go through 2 mobs and hit that third. This one will go through 3 and hit a fourth, and this one will hit 5 mobs if they're in a row. Again, avoid your Curse of Vanishing, but you can see there's actually 3 up here, and that's because there really are 3 choices. I do like the Multi-Shot. It does have its place. I also like the Piercing. It does have its place. And then I also just like the regular one. And that has its place as well in terms of you don't want over penetration. You don't want that spreading shot because maybe you're shooting around where your villagers are. You don't want it to go through a mob and kill a villager. And you don't want to have one of your 3 arrows go off to the side and kill a villager or get their iron golem angry. So really there is a place for all of these if there is a place for the crossbow. And let's talk about if there is a place for that crossbow. And then we'll talk about ammo in a moment. But let's talk about our crossbow and bow damage. And you can see that over here. And you can see that one side clearly has a higher stack than the other. But let's get into that a little bit. So right here we have our damage points for our crossbow. And arrows are a little finicky. They have maximums, they have minimums. Sometimes they're affected by speed. In fact, there's a contraption out there that one-shots an Ender Dragon by using TNT to hyper-accelerate an arrow. So these are numbers given in the wiki, but your mileage may vary, so just be aware of that. Now, your crossbow is going to hit a minimum damage of 6 hit points, a maximum damage of 11 hit points, and your average shot is going to be 9 hit points. You can see what that looks like over here. Now we have some specialty ammo there, I'll get to in a second, but your bow with your power 5 and flame is going to hit a low of 23 hit points. I do want to point out the fire is 4 of those hit points, so if it's a mob that is not affected by fire or if it's in water, those won't count. And your bow with your power 5 and flame will hit a high of 25. Again, 4 of that is from the flame. Didn't get to that last one, although you might have snuck a peek. But you can see that the crossbow versus your bow, it doesn't really compare. Now, with your Quick Charge 3, your crossbow is going to be able to fire faster than your bow. And with your crossbow, there's also no worry about short stroking it. If you don't hold your arrow back for the full charge, it does less damage. That's not an issue with your crossbow because it just won't load or fire. You can also carry these loaded, so you can pull them out and shoot them instantly, which is something you can't do for an arrow. Let me also point out that there are some, I don't want to call them intangibles, but kind of. Your average damage or your max damage, this is per mob. So if you find yourself in a place where you can shoot 5 mobs at the same time with your same arrow, then really this damage has been multiplied by 5, which is better at that point. If you can multiply it by 3, it's also better. But really, the number of times you're going to be able to do that are not super high, because if you're surrounded by that many mobs, you're probably running away or using your sword. But if you do like shooting it out from a distance, that is something to keep in mind. My preference is for the bow, but there are 2 wild cards, and you can see we have high stack here and a high stack here, and this is for your specialty ammo, and that be your Firework Rockets. Now, if you load a Firework Rocket with 7 firework stars, and I'll show you how to do that in 1 second, that's a low of 11 or a high of 18 hit points. And this also is based on the proximity of where they are in that firework explosion. But you can see that it is more powerful than your typical crossbow shot, although obviously more expensive. And you can also use specialty arrows. So on this one, I added a harming 2 arrow, and that changes this from the 25 to 35 to 37, again, depending on if it's the high or low. And that is a heck of a damaging shot. Again, however, the potion of harming in general, whether you put it on an arrow or whether you throw it at, affects different mobs differently. Undead mobs, it actually heals, so keep that in mind. The potions or arrows of healing hurt those undead mobs and will do the opposite to the alive mobs. So just be careful, and these are also very expensive to make, and I'll show you that as we go through this right now. And these are our arrows, and they're craftable like this, although typically you're going to find them on the ground. And then you can make your arrows which cause mobs to glow with some glowstone dust, or to make these specialty arrows that you see here. I don't think I have all of them, but I have most of them listed here as I scroll through them very quickly. And then this one, depending on your version, you can get, but most of the time you can't get it. They put it in, they take it out, they put it in, they take it out. Just something to keep in mind. You need to get a lingering potion to surround the arrows with, and that means you need to collect the dragon breath from your Ender Dragon fight. So you can't even get these arrows until you beat the dragon. Do be sure to collect a lot of that breath when you do, so you can make things like this if you want. And in terms of our fireworks, you can make a firework star by combining a gunpowder with a dye. You can do different dyes in different combinations and make specialty fireworks, but I'm just talking about damage here. And then you take 7 of these stars and you put them in a crafting recipe with 1 more gunpowder and 1 piece of paper, and that will get you 3 firework rockets that all have 7 of those balls, which is what does the damage. So it is also an expensive recipe, at least up until you have a decent mob or creeper or other gunpowder farm, because you need a decent amount of gunpowder per rocket. And that's how you get your specialty arrows. In terms of my preference, I much prefer the bow, in part because I'm just frankly more used to it, but it does typically a decent amount more damage, and it's just easier to keep and hold on to. I don't like the crossbow all that much, but I do like having them around just for some variety and to mix it up. But as part of your repertoire and what you're carrying around, you can keep your trident on you for when you're underwater, but I would highly recommend, even without this fire aspect, although you saw I put it on for some of them, that you use your Smite 5 sword with a Sharp 5 axe, and then keep your Power 5 bow on you. And that will keep you set for just about any situation you find yourself in, if you're going to be able to get out of it. If you found this video helpful, I would appreciate a like. Found it interesting, maybe even share it with a friend or two. And for more videos like this, do be sure to subscribe. Once again, thanks for stopping by.